The first crack of thunder rolled across the Kansas plains like the voice of God passing judgment, and Harvey Granger felt it in his chest before he ever saw the black wall of cloud climbing over the horizon behind him. It was the second week of June in the year 1879, and the grass along the Arkansas River had grown tall and green from a wet spring, the kind of grass that made cattlemen smile and made the sky, when it finally turned meaner than usual to make up for lost time. Harvey sat his horse on a low rise 3 miles east of Dodge City, Ford County, Kansas, with his collar turned up against a wind that had shifted twice in the last hour, and he watched the color drain out of the western sky until it was the deep, bruised purple of a wound that had not yet started to bleed. He was 27 years old, broad through the shoulders from 10 years of rope and saddle, with sun-cracked hands and a face that had learned, the hard way, not to trust kindness until it proved itself twice over. He wore a battered gray Stetson, a canvas duster gone the color of dust, and a Colt single-action army on his hip that he had bought with his own wages, the first thing he had ever owned outright that no man could take from him and call it charity. He had built something of himself in the 5 years since he had ridden away from Graves' Hollow Ranch with nothing but the clothes on his back and the echo of Delia Graves' voice telling him he was worthless. He had a small spread of his own now, 80 acres and a herd of cattle he had bought a few head at a time, driving other men's beeves up the western trail from Texas until he had saved enough to be his own man. He had a name in 3 counties as the best roper on the Cimarron, and men who once would not have spat on him now tipped their hats when he rode into Dodge City to sell his stock. None of that mattered to him half so much, in that moment, as the fact that the storm building on the horizon was rolling straight toward the low draw where the Graves family drove their cattle every June to the summer range, and that somewhere out there, under that terrible sky, was a woman he had never stopped loving, no matter how far he had ridden or how many years he had let pass. Her name was Delia Graves, and she had been 20 years old the last time he saw her, standing in the yard of her father's ranch with tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face, begging her father to listen, to be fair, while Harvey sat his horse with his bedroll behind the cantle and nowhere in the world to go. That had been 5 years ago. She would be 25 now. He wondered, as the wind picked up and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, whether she still hated him for leaving, or whether, in some small corner of her heart, she understood that he had not had a choice. He turned his horse, a big rawbone bay he called Ranger, and looked east toward Dodge City, where his own small herd waited safe in a rented pasture, where a warm bed and a dry roof and a life he had built with his own 2 hands were waiting for him to come home to. Then he looked west into the storm, toward the ranch that had once called him worthless, and he did not hesitate for more than the space of a single breath. He put his heels to Ranger's flanks and rode toward the darkness. 5 years earlier, in the spring of 1874, Harvey Granger had been a 22-year-old drifter with a dead father's saddle and no family left living, hired on at Graves' Hollow Ranch to break horses and mend fence for wages that were fair if not generous. Delia Graves ran 3,000 head of cattle across land that stretched from the Arkansas River bottoms up into the short grass hills, and he ran his household the same way he ran his ranch, with a firm hand and very little patience for foolishness. Harvey had not meant to fall in love with the rancher's daughter. He had told himself that 100 times in the years since, lying awake under 100 different stars on 100 different trail drives, and it had never once made the truth of it feel less true. Delia Graves had a way of laughing that made a man forget he was tired, a way of sitting a horse that made other riders look clumsy by comparison, and a way of looking at Harvey when he came in from the range, sunburned and saddle-sore, that made him feel like the only man in Kansas worth looking at. They had been careful, at first. She would bring him coffee at the corral fence in the mornings and pretend it was nothing more than kindness to a hired hand. He would find reasons to ride the fence line nearest the house at dusk, when she liked to walk after supper, and pretend it was nothing more than doing his job thoroughly. But a ranch is a small world, and it was not long before Delia Graves noticed the way his daughter's eyes followed the young hired man across the yard, and the way the young hired man's hands shook just slightly when he handed her down from her horse. "You are not to think on my daughter," Delia had told him one evening in the tack room, his voice low and hard as flint. "You have no name worth speaking of, no land, no cattle of your own, and no father living to vouch for your character. Whatever foolishness has taken root in that girl's head, you will not water it." Harvey had said, "Yes, sir," because there was nothing else a hired man could say to the man who paid his wages and owned the roof over his head. But he had not stopped loving her, and she had not stopped loving him, and for another year they had gone on finding small, stolen moments, a hand brushing a hand at the well, a look held a heartbeat too long across a crowded supper table, until the night everything fell apart. It was late September, dry as old bone, when lightning struck the North Hay barn and set it ablaze in the dead of night. Harvey had been the first man out of the bunkhouse, the first man hauling water, the first man dragging half-panicked horses out of the adjoining corral while sparks rained down like a plague out of Egypt. He had burned his hands badly doing it, had breathed enough smoke to cough blood for a week afterward, and had saved 4 horses and kept the fire from spreading to the main barn, where the winter's hay and half the ranch's tools were stored. It should have been the night men spoke of his courage for years afterward. Instead, Delia Graves' foreman, a bitter, small-souled man named Otis Crane who had never liked Harvey and liked him less for the way Delia looked at him, told Delia that he had seen Harvey near the hay barn earlier that evening, smoking a cigarette he had no business smoking so close to dry hay, and that in his opinion, the fire was no accident of lightning at all, but carelessness or worse. There had been no lightning that anyone else had seen, Crane said. No storm that night. Only Harvey Granger, alone by the hay barn with a lit match in his hand. It was a lie. Harvey had indeed been near the barn that evening, but only to meet Delia in secret, and the only fire he had lit was the one in his own chest when she kissed him for the first time beneath the eaves. He could not say that to Delia Graves without ruining her reputation and destroying the one thing he loved most in the world, so he had said nothing at all, only stood before Delia Graves in the yard the next morning with his burned hands wrapped in linen and his jaw set, and let the accusation stand. "You have cost me a barn and nearly cost me my horses," Delia had said, his voice carrying across the yard so that every hand on the place could hear it, "and you have made a fool of my daughter besides. I took you in when you had nothing, Harvey Granger, and this is how you repay a man's charity. You are worthless. Do you hear me? Worthless. I will not have a worthless man's name spoken in the same breath as my daughter's. Get your horse and get off my land, and do not let me find you within 10 miles of Graves Hollow again." Delia had come running from the house at the sound of her father's raised voice, her hair still loose from sleep, and she had thrown herself between them, begging her father to listen, telling him it was not true that Harvey had saved the horses, that Harvey would never do such a thing. Delia had looked at his daughter with something like heartbreak in his own eyes, the heartbreak of a father who believed, wrongly but completely, that he was protecting his child from a man who would only ever bring her ruin, and he had told her, not unkindly but with iron finality, to go back inside the house. Harvey had ridden away that morning without a backward glance, because he could not bear to look at her and see her crying, and know that there was nothing he could do to fix what her father believed about him. He had carried the word worthless with him across 4 states and 100 cattle drives, had heard it in his own voice when he doubted himself in the dark, had sworn to himself 1,000 times that he would prove Delia Graves wrong even though Delia Graves would likely never know or care whether he had. He had never stopped loving Delia Graves, not for one single day in 5 long years. The storm hit the Graves Hollow cattle crossing at Coyote Creek, with a suddenness that caught even men who had lived their whole lives on the Kansas plains by surprise. Delia Graves, 61 years old now and slower than he used to be, had made the decision that morning to push the herd across the ford before the weather turned, gambling that they had another few hours of daylight and dry ground before the storm that had been building all week finally broke. It was a gamble he lost. Delia Graves rode at the rear of the herd that afternoon, same as she had every June since she was old enough to sit a horse properly, keeping the drags moving and watching for stragglers, while her younger brother Jesse, 19 years old and eager to prove himself a man in his father's eyes, rode point up near the water with two of the ranch hands. Silas himself rode the flank, directing the herd toward the shallow crossing where the creek bed widened, and the water usually ran no deeper than a horse's knee. The sky had been the color of an old bruise all morning, and by early afternoon it had turned the color of a fresh one, purple-black and swollen, with a low continuous mutter of thunder that never quite broke into full storm and never quite went away either. The first hard gust of wind hit the herd just as the lead cattle were entering the water, and it came with such force that it knocked hats from heads and sent a fine spray of grit into every eye on the crossing. Then the rain came, not gently, not as a warning, but all at once, as though a great barrel in the sky had tipped over and emptied itself directly onto Coyote Creek. Within minutes the placid, knee-deep water had begun to rise, first to the cattle's bellies, then higher, churning brown and furious as runoff from higher ground came pouring down every draw and gully for miles around, funneling into the creek bed until it was no longer a creek at all but something closer to a river in full, murderous flood. Get them across now. Delia Graves shouted, his voice nearly lost in the wind, and he spurred his horse down the bank to push the confused, bawling cattle forward, when a bolt of lightning struck a cottonwood not 40 feet away with a crack like the end of the world. His horse reared in terror, twisted beneath him, and went down hard on the slick clay bank, rolling once and pinning Silas's leg beneath its own weight before scrambling up and bolting off into the rain, leaving the old man crumpled in the mud with his leg bent wrong beneath him and the rising water already licking at his boots. Jesse Graves, seeing his father go down, spurred his own horse toward him without a thought for his own safety, but the bank gave way beneath his mount's hooves in the churned mud, and boy and horse both went into the flood together. The current took Jesse instantly, tearing him from the saddle, and the last thing the hands on the far bank saw before the rain closed like a curtain was Jesse Graves's white face turned toward them, one arm flung up, before the brown water swallowed him from view. Delia heard her brothers scream even over the roar of the storm, and she put her horse into the water without a moment's hesitation, driving toward the place she had last seen him, screaming his name into the wind, while behind her the cattle bawled and scattered and her father lay trapped and bleeding on the bank with the flood rising toward his chest. It was in that moment, with the world coming apart at every seam, that Harvey Granger came over the rise above Coyote Creek on his big bay horse, half blind with rain, and saw the whole disaster laid out below him like something out of a nightmare he had ridden 3 hours through a black storm to reach. He did not think. There was no time to think, and 5 years of hard living had taught him that a man who thought too long in a moment like this was a man who arrived too late to matter. He saw Jesse Graves first, a dark shape tumbling in the brown flood some 60 yards downstream of the crossing, one hand still clawing at the surface, and Harvey turned Ranger down the slope at a pace that would have been reckless on dry ground and was nothing short of suicidal on mud slick as grease. But he had ridden worse ground than this chasing runaway steers on the Cimarron, and Ranger, God bless the animal, trusted him enough to try. He uncoiled his lariat as he rode, a skill so deeply worn into his hands after 10 years of cattle work that he did not need to look at the rope to know exactly how much slack he carried. And when he came alongside the flooding creek at the point where the current had slowed just enough around a bend to give him half a chance, he stood in his stirrups and threw. The rope sailed out through the rain, and the loop dropped clean over Jesse's flailing arm and shoulder, and Harvey hauled back on it with every ounce of strength in his body, wrapping the rope twice around the saddle horn and driving Ranger backward up the bank even as the current fought to keep its prize. For one terrible moment the rope went taut as a fiddle string, and Harvey thought it would either snap or pull Jesse's arm from its socket. But then the boy came free of the deepest part of the current in a tangle of limbs and mud, and Harvey dragged him bodily up onto the bank, coughing and retching creek water, but alive, gloriously, impossibly alive. "Where's your father?" Harvey shouted over the wind, hauling Jesse up by the collar. "Where's Silas?" Jesse could not speak for coughing, but he flung an arm back toward the crossing, and Harvey saw, through the sheeting rain, the shape of the old man still crumpled on the bank with the water climbing steadily higher around him, and beyond him, fighting her own terrified horse at the edge of the flood, the unmistakable figure of Delia Graves. "Stay here," Harvey told Jesse, pressing the rope into his hands. "Hold to that cottonwood root and do not move." He did not wait to see whether the boy obeyed. He was already back in the saddle, driving Ranger through the shallower water at the crossing's edge, angling toward the old man on the bank. Silas Graves looked up as the shadow of a horse fell across him, rain running down a face gone gray with pain, and for one long moment father and the man he had once cast off looked at each other across 5 years and a flood, and something passed between them that neither of them would ever fully put into words, though both of them would remember it until the day they died. "You," Silas said, his voice cracking, not with anger this time but with disbelief, and something that might almost have been shame. "Me," Harvey said, and swung down from the saddle into water up past his knees, working his hands beneath the old man's shoulders. "Your leg's broke. I need you to bear what you can on the good one and let me do the rest." "Boy, I told you never to set foot on my land again," Silas said, half a protest, half a plea, as Harvey hauled him up out of the rising water with a strength born of pure desperate will. "You did," Harvey agreed, grunting with the effort of half carrying, half dragging the old man up the slick bank away from the flood's reach. "And I am fixing to ignore that, on account of you being about to drown otherwise, and me not being the kind of worthless man who'd let that happen just to spite you." He got Silas up onto drier ground and propped against the trunk of the same cottonwood where Jesse sat clutching the lariat, and only then did he allow himself to look for Delia. She was still down at the crossing, still fighting to hold her terrified horse steady in water that was rising by the minute, shouting something Harvey could not hear over the storm, and even as he watched, a fresh surge of floodwater, born of some new cloudburst higher up the watershed, came roaring down the creek bed in a wall of brown water and broken branches that struck her horse broadside and knocked the animal clean off its feet. Harvey did not remember mounting Ranger again. He would tell people later when they asked that he simply found himself already riding, already shouting her name into the storm, already committing every last ounce of himself to the single desperate purpose of reaching her before the flood did. Delia had been thrown clear of her horse when it went down, and for a terrible handful of seconds she vanished entirely beneath the brown water, and Harvey's heart stopped so completely in his chest that he would swear afterward the world itself had gone silent around him. Then her head broke the surface 20 feet downstream, gasping, her arms flailing for purchase on nothing at all, and Harvey drove Ranger into the flood without a second's hesitation, leaning far out of the saddle with his arm outstretched. "Delia, grab hold." She turned toward the sound of her name, toward a voice she had not heard in 5 long years but would have known anywhere, in any storm, in any lifetime, and some instinct older than fear reached her arm up out of the current toward him. Their hands met in the churning brown water, his grip like iron closing around her wrist, and he hauled her up and across the saddle in front of him with a strength that came from somewhere beyond his own body, some place fed entirely by love and terror, and 5 years of unfinished longing. Ranger fought for footing in the current, found it, and drove for the bank with the desperate, straining power of a good horse who understood, in whatever way horses understand such things, that everything now depended on him. They broke free of the deepest water and scrambled up onto solid ground not 30 feet from where Delia and Delia Graves sat huddled against the cottonwood, and Harvey pulled Ranger to a stop and slid from the saddle, still holding Delia against him, both of them soaked through and shaking and alive. For a long moment neither of them said a word. The rain hammered down around them, the wind tore at their clothes, and somewhere out in the flooded creek bed, the last stragglers of the scattered herd bawled their confusion to a sky that had no mercy left to give that day. But none of it mattered in the small space where Harvey Granger held Delia Graves in his arms for the first time in 5 years and felt her heart hammering against his own. "Harvey," she said finally, his name coming out of her on a sob that was half relief and half disbelief. "Harvey, you came back. I never should have had to come back," he said, his voice rough with rain and feeling both. "I should never have left in the first place. I am sorry it took a flood to bring me to my senses." She pulled back just far enough to look up into his face, rain running down both their cheeks so that it was impossible to say where the storm ended and the tears began, and she said, "I never stopped waiting for you, not for one single day." There was no time in that moment for anything more than that, because Delia Graves was calling out from beneath the cottonwood, his voice thin with pain but urgent, and the storm was not finished with them yet. "The wagon," Delia managed, when Harvey knelt beside him to check the break in his leg. "We left the chuck wagon and 2 of the hands up on the rise above the second draw. If this flood keeps rising the way it has been, that whole low stretch will go under within the hour." Harvey looked out through the rain toward the rise Delia meant, a low fold of ground perhaps half a mile distant, and understood immediately the danger. A chuck wagon caught in a flooding draw, with men who might not know how bad the water had gotten this close to the creek, was a wagon and men both likely to be swept away before nightfall. "I will go," he said, already moving toward Ranger. "You have done enough," Delia said, catching his sleeve, fear plain in her voice. "You have pulled 3 of us out of that water already, Harvey. You cannot go back out into that storm again." "There are men out there who do not know what is coming," Harvey said gently, covering her hand with his own for just a moment. "I cannot leave them to guess at it. I will come back to you, Delia. I promise you that, but I have to go." She looked at him for a long moment, rain streaming down her face, and then she nodded because she understood, in a way she had not fully understood 5 years before, exactly the kind of man Harvey Granger truly was, and it had never once had anything to do with the word her father had thrown at him in anger. "Then take Jesse's rope," she said, pressing the coiled lariat into his hands, "and hurry back to me." Harvey mounted Ranger and rode north along the rise, the storm still raging around him but beginning, at last, to show the first faint signs of exhausting itself, the thunder growing more distant, the rain settling into a hard, steady fall rather than the earlier apocalyptic deluge. He found the chuck wagon exactly where Delia had said it would be, mired axle-deep in a draw that was rapidly filling with runoff. The 2 ranch hands, a grizzled old cook named Amos and a young rider barely out of his teens named Wilson, working frantically and uselessly to free the wheels while the water crept higher around them. "Leave the wagon," Harvey shouted, riding down into the draw. "It is not worth your lives. Cut the team loose and ride for high ground now." Amos looked up, recognized him despite the years and the rain, and for a moment something like wonder crossed the old cook's weathered face. "Harvey Granger, well, I will be. Never thought I would see you on Graves' land again." "Neither did I," Harvey said. "Cut the team loose, Amos. There is no time for talk." They worked quickly, cutting the traces and freeing the 2 draft mules from the sinking wagon, and within minutes all 3 men, riding double where necessary, were climbing out of the draw toward higher ground, leaving the chuck wagon to its fate in the rising water. They had barely cleared the low ground when a fresh surge came down the draw and lifted the wagon bodily, spinning it once before the current carried it off into the gathering dusk. And Harvey understood, watching it go, exactly how close a call it had been for the two men he had just pulled free. The ride back to the crossing took the better part of an hour, the storm finally breaking apart into scattered, retreating thunderheads that let the last gray light of the June evening through in long, ragged shafts. And by the time Harvey came back over the rise above Coyote Creek, he found the scene transformed from chaos into something closer to a battlefield's grim aftermath. The flood had already begun to recede, leaving behind a wide swath of churned mud and stranded, bawling cattle. But the worst of the danger had passed, and someone had managed to build a fire under the shelter of the cottonwoods to warm the survivors. Delia saw him first, rising from where she knelt beside her father to run to him before he had even fully dismounted. And this time there was no storm to hide the tears on her face, no flood to excuse the way she threw her arms around his neck in front of her father and her brother and the hired men and did not care in the slightest who saw. "You came back," she said again, as though she still could not quite believe it. "I told you I would," Harvey said, and this time, with the storm behind them and the whole world watching, he kissed her, slowly and thoroughly, the way he had wanted to kiss her every single day for 5 long years. Delia Graves watched his daughter kiss the man he had once driven from his land with a curse and a false accusation, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, only sat with his broken leg splinted crudely with 2 straight branches and a torn strip of shirt, his face unreadable in the last of the evening light. Then he cleared his throat, loudly enough that Harvey and Delia broke apart, both of them flushing, and Delia moved instinctively to stand between them again, the way she had 5 years before, as though bracing for another storm entirely. "Father," she began, "I know what you are going to say, and I will not hear it, not after everything." "Delia," Silas said, cutting her off, though not unkindly, "hold your tongue a moment and let an old fool speak if he can find the words for it." She fell silent, watching him warily, and Harvey stood his ground beside her, waiting, because there was nothing else left to do but wait and see whether 5 years and a flood had changed anything at all in the heart of Delia Graves. "I have had 5 years to think on what I said to you, Harvey Granger," Silas said finally, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like exhaustion, though whether it was the exhaustion of the body or the soul, it was hard to say. "Otis Crane came to me 2 winters back, drunk and dying of the lung fever that finally took him, and he told me the truth of that night before he went, that there had been no cigarette, no carelessness, that he had made up the tale out of spite because he could not stand to see my daughter look at a hired hand the way she never once looked at him. I have known for 2 years that I called you worthless for a sin you never committed, and I have not had the courage in all that time to ride out and find you and tell you so." Harvey felt something in his chest that he had carried for 5 years, some old cold weight he had grown so used to that he had nearly forgotten it was there at all, begin slowly to loosen. "You could have written," he said, though there was no real anger left in it, only a kind of tired sorrow for all the years lost to pride and silence. "I could have," Silas agreed. "I did not, because a man does not enjoy admitting he has wronged another man so badly, and because I told myself you had likely built a new life somewhere and did not need an old fool's apology cluttering it up. I see now I was wrong about that too. You came back into a storm that had nothing to do with you anymore, for a family that had given you nothing but cruelty, and you saved my son's life and mine and very nearly my daughter's as well, and you did it without a moment's hesitation, though God knows you owed us none of it." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice had roughened. "I was wrong about you, Harvey Granger. I was wrong about you from the very start, and I am sorry for it. And I do not expect you to forgive an old man easily, but I am asking you to all the same." Harvey looked at the old man for a long moment, at the pain plain on his face from the broken leg, and from something deeper than that, some wound of the conscience that had clearly been troubling him for 2 long years, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not need to search very hard for forgiveness after all. 5 years of anger had worn thin somewhere along the trail, worn down by cattle drives and lonely nights, and the simple hard work of building a life, until what was left underneath, it was only the same love for Delia Graves that had started this whole business in the first place. "You near about drowned in front of me an hour ago, Silas," Harvey said finally, allowing himself the smallest of tired smiles. "I figure a man who has been that close to meeting his maker and lived to tell it deserves the chance to make things right while he still can. I forgive you. I would be lying if I said the last 5 years did not cost me something, because they did, more than I can rightly say. But I would ride through that storm again tonight if it meant getting back here in time. And I mean to keep on riding, if you will let me, for as long as your daughter will have me." Delia let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and turned to her father with a look that asked a question she did not need to voice aloud. "I have no right left to stand in the way of it," Silas said, and for the first time that evening, something like a real smile broke through the pain and exhaustion on his weathered face. "Go on, girl, go to him. You have waited 5 years for the chance, and I will not be the fool who makes you wait a moment longer." She did not need to be told twice. They rode back to Graves Hollow Ranch in the last blue light of that long, terrible, wonderful evening, the storm now nothing more than a retreating rumble on the eastern horizon, the sky overhead washed clean and scattered with the first bright stars of a Kansas summer night. Silas rode in the bed of a hastily repaired hay wagon, his legs splinted and propped, grumbling good-naturedly about the indignity of being hauled home like a sack of feed corn, while Jesse rode alongside on a borrowed horse, still shaking off the last of his fright, casting frequent glances of pure hero worship at the man who had pulled him from the flood. Delia rode beside Harvey, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and neither of them said very much for the first mile or two, content simply to be near one another after so many years of being apart. But eventually she reached over and took his hand, careless of anyone who might see, and held it the rest of the way home. "I heard you had done well for yourself," she said quietly, as the lights of the ranch house came into view ahead of them. "Wilson mentioned it last winter, when he came through Dodge on a drive. Said there was a fellow named Harvey Granger with his own little spread on the Cimarron, and a reputation as the best roper in 3 counties. I did not let myself hope it might be you at first. There are a good many Harveys in Kansas, I told myself. There is only one Harvey Granger fool enough to build a whole life around the hope of one day proving a man wrong who probably never thought of him again," Harvey said, and though there was some old bitterness still buried in the joke, it was fading fast, worn away already by the evening's events and the warmth of her hand in his. "He thought of you," Delia said softly, "more than you know. And I thought of you every single day, Harvey. I want you to know that. There was never anyone else, not really, not in 5 years. I turned down 2 proposals of marriage because neither of those men made me feel the way you did standing at that corral fence with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, while you talked to me about nothing at all and everything that mattered." Harvey's throat tightened, and he had to look away from her for a moment, out at the darkening plains, before he trusted his own voice enough to answer her. "I built that little spread of mine thinking of you every single day too," he admitted finally. "Told myself it was pride, told myself it was spite, told myself 100 different lies about why I was working myself half to death trying to build something out of nothing. But the truth of it is, Delia, I built it because some fool corner of my heart never stopped hoping that one day I might come back this way with something worth offering you, a name that meant something, land of my own, cattle I did not have to borrow or beg for. I did not know if I would ever get the chance to lay it at your feet, but I built it anyway, just in case." "You never needed any of that," Delia said, her voice fierce now, the same fierceness that had put her between her father and Harvey 5 years before. "You never needed land or cattle or any of it, Harvey. I would have loved you standing in nothing but your boots with a hole in your hat, and I told my father exactly that more than once in the years since you left. Maybe I did not build it for you at all then, Harvey said, turning to look at her at last, something easing in his chest that had been tight and aching for 5 long years. Maybe I built it for me. So that when I finally did come back, whether it took a storm or a flood or the good Lord's own trumpet to bring me, I could stand in front of you as a man worth having, and not just a hired hand with nothing to his name but a dead father's saddle. You were always worth having, she said. You simply did not know it yet. The ranch house at Graves Hollow blazed with lamplight by the time the small, weary procession finally rolled into the yard, and Cyrus Beale, the ranch foreman who had stayed behind that day tending the horses and had spent the better part of the storm half sick with worry, came running out to meet them, followed by 2 more hands and the housekeeper, a broad, capable woman named Mrs. Prout, who took one look at Silas's splinted leg and began issuing orders before the wagon had even fully stopped. They carried Silas inside and laid him on the big 4-poster bed he had shared with his late wife Alina for 30 years before her passing, and Mrs. Prout sent Jesse riding hard for the doctor in Dodge City, despite the boy's protests that he was not tired in the slightest, and could stand another hard ride just fine, thank you. Harvey helped settle the horses, working alongside Cyrus Beale in a companionable silence that neither man felt any particular need to fill with words, and it was well past midnight before the household finally began to settle, the storm's damage assessed as far as it could be in darkness, the missing cattle to be gathered and counted properly come morning light. Delia found Harvey sitting alone on the porch steps sometime near 1 in the morning, staring out at a sky now scrubbed clean and glittering with stars, Ranger dozing on 3 legs at the hitching rail nearby, and she came and sat down beside him without a word, close enough that her shoulder rested against his. "Your father will keep his leg?" Harvey asked, though he already suspected the answer, having seen enough broken bones on the trail to know a clean break from a bad one. "The doctor thinks so, if he stays off it and does not try to argue his way back into the saddle too soon, which knowing my father is asking rather a lot," Delia said, and there was real affection in the exasperation of it. "Jesse has not stopped talking about you since we got home. You have made yourself a devoted admirer for life, Harvey Granger. He is already telling Mrs. Prout you roped him out of that flood like something out of a dime novel." "He was not far wrong in his fear," Harvey said quietly, the memory of that terrible moment, watching the boy tumble in the brown water, still sharp enough to make his stomach turn even now. "I have never been so frightened in all my life as I was in that moment before the rope caught. And then you did it again for my father," Delia said, "and again for me. I do not think I properly thanked you yet for any of it." "You do not need to thank me," Harvey said, turning to look at her in the starlight. "I did not ride into that storm for thanks, Delia. I rode into it because the thought of losing you, or your father, or your brother, when I might have had some small chance to stop it, was a thought I simply could not live with. I have spent 5 years living with the ache of losing you once already. I was not about to lose you a second time to a flood, not while I still had breath in my body and a horse under me." She was quiet for a moment, watching him, her eyes shining in the lamplight spilling out from the parlor window behind them. "I used to lie awake at night," she said softly, "wondering if I had imagined how you felt about me. Wondering if perhaps my father had been right, and you had only ever been passing time with a rancher's foolish daughter before moving on to a life that did not include either of us. It is a hard thing, Harvey, loving a memory for 5 years and not knowing whether the man behind it still exists anywhere in the world, or whether you have only kept alive some story you told yourself to make the losing of him easier to bear." "I am no memory," Harvey said, reaching over to take her hand again, threading his fingers through hers. "I am right here, Delia. Flesh and blood and mud clean up to my knees still, likely. And I have loved you every single day of those 5 years just as hard as the day I rode away, whether you believed it possible or not. I am asking you now, plain and simple, the way I should have found some way to ask you 5 years ago before your father ever had the chance to send me off. Will you have me? Not as a hired hand this time, and not as a man with nothing to his name. I have 80 acres on the Cimarron and a herd worth having, and a name that no longer means worthless in any mouth in 3 counties. I am asking you to marry me, Delia Graves, and to come build the rest of a life with me that we should have started building 5 years ago. Delia did not answer him with words at first. She answered him by leaning forward and kissing him there on the porch steps under a sky full of stars that had, only hours before, been full of nothing but storm and fury, and when she finally pulled back far enough to speak, her voice was thick with tears that were, this time, entirely happy ones. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Harvey Granger, 1,000 times yes. I have been waiting 5 years to say it. I am not about to make either of us wait a single day longer than we have to." They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright July morning with the Kansas sky scrubbed clean of storm clouds, and the grass along the Arkansas River grown tall and green from all that early rain. In the yard at Graves Hollow Ranch beneath the same cottonwood tree where Delia Graves had once told Harvey Granger to get off his land and never come back. Delia gave his daughter away leaning on a hickory cane, his broken leg still healing but well enough to bear his weight for the short walk it required, and there was not a trace left in his weathered face of the hard, unyielding man who had cast a penniless hired hand off his ranch 5 years before. He had spent the week since the flood making what amends he could, not merely in words but in deeds, insisting that Harvey and Delia settle at Graves Hollow rather than the smaller spread on the Cimarron, offering to fold Harvey's own hard-won herd in with the Graves cattle and make him full partner in the ranch, an offer Harvey had at first refused out of old pride before finally accepting when he understood it was offered not out of pity but out of genuine respect, earned honestly at last. The hard way, in the middle of a flood. Jesse Graves stood as Harvey's best man, having appointed himself to the role with a fierce, unshakable loyalty that made both Harvey and Delia laugh more than once at the boy's insistence on the matter. And the whole of Ford County, it seemed, turned out for the wedding, drawn as much by curiosity over the dramatic tale of the flood rescue, already growing taller with each retelling in the saloons of Dodge City, as by any real acquaintance with the bride and groom. Reverend Thomas Whitfield, who had ridden out from Dodge City for the occasion, spoke words that afternoon about storms and second chances, about the way the hardest trials of a life sometimes cleared the ground for something better to grow. And Harvey, standing beneath the cottonwood in a new black suit that still felt strange and stiff against his sun-browned skin, thought that the Reverend had never spoken truer words in his life. When at last the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, and Harvey kissed his bride for the first time as her husband rather than merely the man who loved her, the whole yard erupted into cheering loud enough, Jesse would swear for years afterward, to have been heard clear in Dodge City itself. Delia Graves, watching from his chair with his cane propped against his knee, wiped at his eyes with the back of one weathered hand and did not bother pretending it was merely the dust that had gotten into them. "Your mother would have loved him," he said quietly to Delia, when she came to embrace him after the ceremony, tears of joy bright on her own face. "She always did have a better eye for character than I did, God rest her soul. I'm only sorry it took me so long and so nearly cost us all so much to see what she would have seen in that boy the very first day he rode onto this ranch." "He never held it against you, father," Delia said softly. "Not once he understood the truth of it. That is simply the kind of man he is." "I know it," Delia said. "And I thank God every day since that flood that he is the kind of man he is, and that my foolishness did not cost me the chance to know it." The years that followed were not without their own hardships, as no life on the Kansas plains in that era ever truly was. There were dry summers when the grass burned brown by July, and the cattle had to be driven farther afield for water, And there was a hard winter in 1881 that took a portion of the herd despite everything Harvey and Cyrus Beale could do to shelter them. And there was the slow, steady work of building barbed wire fence line by line across land that had once run open and free. A change that Silas grumbled about constantly, even as he admitted, in his more honest moments, that it was probably the way of the future, whether he approved of it or not. But there was also, in far greater measure, a happiness that neither Harvey nor Delia had quite believed themselves entitled to, back in the darkest days of their 5-year separation. Harvey took to ranch management with the same quiet, thorough competence he had brought to every other task he had ever set his hand to. And within a few years Graves, Hollow Ranch, now known to most of the county simply as the Granger Place, though Silas insisted on keeping the old name on the deed out of stubborn sentiment, had grown to be one of the most respected and prosperous spreads along the Arkansas River bottoms. Silas Graves lived another 11 years past that terrible, wonderful flood, long enough to see his daughter's marriage flourish and to watch, with a grandfather's fierce and unguarded pride, the arrival of 2 grandchildren, a boy first, born in the spring of 1880 and named Silas Harvey Granger after both his grandfather and his father in a gesture that reduced the old man to tears he no longer bothered trying to hide, and a girl 2 years after that, named Alina after the grandmother she would never meet but whose gentle, generous spirit her mother swore she could see already in the child's laughing eyes. Jesse Graves grew into a fine horseman under Harvey's patient tutelage, eventually taking over management of the ranch's breeding stock, and he married, some years later, a schoolteacher from Dodge City named Ruth Calloway, settling on a portion of Graves' hollow land that Silas deeded to him outright as a wedding gift, so that the whole family remained close, bound not merely by blood but by the shared memory of the storm that had so nearly torn them all apart and had instead, in the strange and mysterious way such things sometimes happen, bound them together more tightly than ever before. Harvey never did forget the word Silas Graves had once thrown at him in anger, worthless, and he kept it, in a strange way, close to him for the rest of his life, not as a wound any longer but as a kind of quiet reminder of how far a man could travel, given enough determination and enough love to travel for, from the lowest opinion another man might hold of him to a life built solid and lasting on his own 2 hands. He would tell his children, when they were old enough to understand it, the whole story of that day at Coyote Creek, the storm and the flood and the rope thrown true across churning brown water, and he would tell them, too, about the 5 hard years that had come before it, the years of being called worthless and believing, for a while, that it might even be true. A man's worth, he told his son Silas Harvey Granger one evening many years later, the boy grown by then into a young man himself, sitting with his father on the same porch steps where Harvey had once proposed to Delia beneath a sky full of stars, is not a thing another man gets to decide for him, no matter how much power he holds over your wages or your bed for the night. Your worth is a thing you build for yourself, one honest day's work at a time, and you carry it with you wherever you go, storm or no storm, until the day comes when the rest of the world finally catches up to what you always knew about yourself. Did you always know it? His son asked. Even when grandfather Silas called you worthless and sent you away? Harvey considered the question for a long moment, watching the sun go down gold and orange over land that had once nearly cost him everything, and had instead, in the end, given him everything he had ever truly wanted. No, he admitted honestly. There were nights out on that trail, alone under the stars with nothing but a borrowed horse and a saddle that had belonged to my dead father, when I believed every word of it. But your mother never stopped believing otherwise, not for one single day of those 5 years, and in the end, it was her believing in me that got me through the darkest of it, long before I ever managed to believe it fully myself. That is a piece of wisdom worth remembering, son. Find someone who believes in you when you cannot manage to believe in yourself, and hold onto her with everything you have got, because that kind of love is rarer and more precious than all the cattle and all the land in Kansas put together. Delia came out onto the porch just then, drawn by the sound of their voices. Her dark hair streaked now with the first threads of silver, but her eyes as bright and warm as they had been on the day Harvey first pulled her from the flood, and she settled herself onto the porch step beside her husband the way she had done 1,000 times over the years, since that terrible, wonderful storm, resting her head against his shoulder as the last of the sunset burned itself out over the wide Kansas plains. "What are my two favorite men discussing so seriously out here?" she asked, "while the biscuits go cold on the table inside." "Nothing that will not keep until after supper," Harvey said, wrapping his arm around her and pulling her close, the old rope-scarred hands that had once thrown a lariat true across a raging flood, now gentle as they smoothed a strand of hair back from her face. "I was only telling our son the truth of how his mother saved his father's life a long time before any flood ever came along to give me the chance to return the favor." "Is that so?" Delia said, smiling up at him with all the love of 20 years still shining plain in her eyes. "As I recall it, Harvey Granger, we saved each other. That has always been the way of it between us. From the very first day you rode onto my father's ranch with nothing but a dead man's saddle and more courage in your little finger than most men manage in a lifetime." "I suppose we did," Harvey agreed, and he leaned down and kissed her softly there on the porch steps as the last light faded from the sky, while their son watched with the easy, unself-conscious happiness of a young man who had never known his parents any other way than deeply, thoroughly, permanently in love. And somewhere out past the barbed wire fences and the wide green pastures of Graves Hollow Ranch, the cattle settled peacefully into the cool of a Kansas evening, safe and sound beneath a sky that held no storm at all, only stars, endless and bright and utterly at peace. And that, in the end, was the whole of the story that Harvey Granger and Delia Graves would tell their grandchildren for years to come, long after Silas had gone to rest beside his beloved Eleanor beneath the cottonwood tree, where his daughter had married the man he had once. In a moment of fear and pride, he spent the rest of his life making right, called worthless. It was a story about a storm that had nearly taken everything, and about a man who rode into it anyway, not for reward and not for reconciliation, though he found both in the end, but simply because his heart had never once, in 5 long years of exile, stopped belonging to the family that had cast him out, and because some loves, the truest and most enduring kind, are strong enough to outlast even the bitterest storm a hard world can throw against them.